Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Ken. I'm not really sure what's going on, but all right. Well, good evening, all, as they say. I'm going to look today at Anglicanism in Australia, and just to say one or two things beforehand. Owing to my incompetencies last week, not this week, the lecture wasn't recorded. So what will be put up is a previous lecture by a previous member of staff. It won't bear all that much resemblance, I suspect, to actually what I gave you, but the PowerPoints at least are on the web. So my mistake. It's one of these things, it's a bit like today, you know, they say, just come in, it'll all be, you know, you're right, thank you very much. Okay, so before we get down to this, is there any questions or uncertainties that exist in the room about what's been said or required of you so far?
No, all good.
Okay, all right, let's box on then. He says with a bit of trepidation. Okay, up until in Australia, of course, Anglicanism arrives as part of a military establishment. It arrives in the form of one Richard Johnson, who was the chaplain to the penal colony, and it arrives, of course, like the rest of the First Fleet, in 1788. And at this time, 1788, the Church of England in England is established. That is, it has that kind of legal, political monopoly of legal religion. And as such, it is the privileged, monopolistic form of Christianity that exists in England, and because England is the predominant power of the United Kingdom of England, Ireland and Scotland, it arrives with that kind of background in Australia. And so really for the first few decades of Anglicanism in Australia, it has a sort of quasi-establishment. It's not, and never was, actually legally enacted as an establishment, but it has that kind of cultural and semi-legal status as a colony of Britain, which brings that kind of monopolistic reality to the Church of England in Australia. So in New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, which of course are the oldest colonies, and New South Wales of course then incorporated what we now know as Queensland, and Van Diemen's Land as it was originally called until they basically decided one way of dealing with the stigma of it being a penal colony is to change the name, and so they called it Tasmania. But Van Diemen's Land in New South Wales, it was originally envisaged that Anglicanism in Australia would be more or less a mirror image of its English progenitor, and it would be more or less an established church with all of the privilege and monopoly that came with it. Oops, oh dear, it's always a worry. Okay. And this was really the reality until that constitutional revolution that I talked about last week, whereby in Britain, non-Anglicans, in the form firstly in 1828 of non-conformist Protestants, and then in 1829, even more surprisingly, Roman Catholics, were enfranchised. That's been called by a very eminent historian as a constitutional revolution. It changed the whole political landscape of England, and therefore it changed the whole political landscape of British colonies. So things that were heading in the direction of an established church for the Church of England in English and British colonies quickly went into reverse. as a result. And what happens is, both in England gradually, but in the colonies quite quickly, including all the Australian colonies, the Church of England begins to be treated by the colonial governments as just another denomination. Now, of course, just another denomination still was the largest denomination, and it still had leaders who had, shall we say, cultural and political clout back home. But most of the privilege that we see being coming the way of the Church of England in Australian colonies is a result of it being the largest denomination. So it gets more share of the money, but it's given to the largest denomination on the same basis that all of the, or most of the other denominations get it. There just happens to be more of them.
Question,
Yes, by all means.
when the Church of England became disestablished,
In where? Well, it was never disestablished because it was never actually established. It was this quasi-establishment, a kind of political and cultural expectation of privilege, both by the colonial officials and by the church itself, but it was never actually legally established.
Okay. I was wondering if that affected the monarch's role at all then.
No, because if you remember by now, more or less, while the monarch is legally the head of the Church of England, in fact, it was a supremacy being actually implemented by the ministry, by the government, and particularly by the Prime Minister. Yeah.
But the bishops still had to kiss the Queen's ring, so to speak.
Bishops in England did,
Yes.
as members of the House of Lords. And as bishops also, they came under her supremacy, yes. So the bishops had a sense of the monarch being the head of the church, but in fact they were appointed in the first place by the Prime Minister. And they tended to reflect whichever, shall we say, party, Whig or Tory, and then later Conservative or Liberal, the Prime Minister came from. So basically, by about the 1830s, we begin to get Australian denominationalism. That is, we begin to get the Australian colonies reflecting the situation that had been in Britain of the Church of England being one denomination, albeit the largest and most influential, among other denominations. It's no longer politically and legally able to claim privilege. So, just before we come to that here, one example of this quasi-establishment is in the 1820s in New South Wales, there was passed by the colonial legislature an act of the Australian colonial legislature called the Church and Schools Corporation Act. And this gave to the Church of England only 1/7 of all Crown lands, which were to be for the building of churches and schools of the Church of England only. But by the end of the 1830s, with the Constitutional Revolution, while this stayed on the books, statute books for a bit, it was a dead letter. It never actually, well, it kicked off to some extent, but it didn't last very long. And of course, there were other grants of Crown lands. That's why, for example, one of the suburbs of Sydney is called Glebe. It's called Glebe because a glebe is the parson's land attached to the parish for his income. So that gives you an idea of what was going on. So basically, by the 1830s, we begin to see the end of Anglican political and legal privilege. And this has to do with one man, this man here, the Governor of New South Wales, Richard Burke. what Richard Burke did was to basically implement in the New South Wales colony, of which he was the governor, the reality of the Church of England now just being one denomination, and therefore other denominations having, as they were in England, to be legally recognised. And what he did was, in 1836, he passed what was called the Church Act. This did away with those semi or quasi-legal, can you see?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just running out of space to, if I sit in here. Did away with the those quasi-legal and political privileges, such as the Church and Schools Corporation Act, and brought in funding for brought in funding for a range of denominations. So they included the Church of England, the Roman Catholic, and the Presbyterian. They didn't include the Methodists, and that became a problem later on. But you can see basically the move of the colonial government is now towards an even-handed denominationalist support. So government money was available to all these three denominations on an equitable basis for the payment of clergy, for the payment of building of churches, and for the building of schools. There were particular qualifications necessary, but the point is that all three denominations were treated equally by this New South Wales legal implementation of denominationalism. So, and this state aid continued in the Australian colonies until the 1850s. One of the reasons was that it was a fairly common assumption across the board, whether you were, shall we say, conservative or liberal in politics, or Anglican or Roman Catholic, that fundamentally churches were important, not just because Britain was a Christian country, but because they inculcated morality. Because of the, to some extent, impoverishment of the Australian colonies, the major source of funding was government. And in fact, in terms of providing schools, the colonial governments in Australia and elsewhere were in advance of Britain itself, because England didn't start to provide government schools until 1871. Earlier in Scotland, but so this aid ceases from the 1850s. It continues, though, in Western Australia because, well, not to put too fine a point on it, Western Australia was the least desirable, most impoverished and unappealing colony probably in the entire British Empire, certainly amongst the Australian colonies. And most people that arrived tried as quickly as possible to get out and go elsewhere. And that didn't change really until the end of the 19th century. So basically, what we began to have was a kind of combination of church and state doing various things, a kind of dual system, and this was particularly in education. Government funding was necessary because there was a depression in most of the colonies, so there wasn't a great deal of ready money privately, so government funding was important. And basically this is the churches bowing to the inevitable. The Church of England particularly did not like this. Anglicans felt that they were the true form of Christian faith, and it was the duty of the state, as a Christian state, to uphold Christian truth, and therefore they should be upholding the true Christian version of faith, which was the Church of England. But basically, even though significant figures like Bishop Broughton of Sydney the first Anglican bishop in Australia, tried to overturn this whole in a sense, even-handed denominationalism, basically the churches had to accept the realities of the new political situation.
This governor just
Governor where?
In Sydney.
In New South Wales. Well, see, basically the governor who implemented this was Burke, followed by, no, I can't remember, sorry.
I just wondered whether Burke, because Burke comes from an Irish
he does,
background,
yes, yes.
So you can understand a bit his motivation.
Yes, he's a liberal, what was then known as Whig, but he's a liberal Irishman of...
Catholic?
No, he's Anglican.
He's Anglican.
No, there's no Roman Catholic colonial officials at that level until in Western Australia we get Governor Weld. He is Roman Catholic. So this is what I mean. Although both the English and the colonial states change because of this constitutional revolution, it takes a long time for some of the, shall we say, cultural forces to change, and the predominant numbers of officials, both in England and colonial governments, were still Anglicans. But it's interesting that even in a colony like Western Australia, where pretty well all of the colonial officials, up until Weld, and more or less really apart from Weld, were Anglicans, they still nevertheless passed their own Church Act in 1840, and they implement this even-handed system. So we get state and denominational schools being implemented. There are, this is why it's called a dual system. There's an educational board for the church schools, and there's an educational board for the government schools. Each school has its own particular board. And basically what they're operating is, the government particularly is operating out of the Irish system, which is this dual system of basically a government school is funded by the government, it's supervised by the government, its teachers are regulated by the government, but the churches are allowed to come in and teach religious instruction, but it has to be very much a kind of Bible-based interdenominational instruction. How they thought that would actually work, I don't know, but there you are. So basically, in this dual system, the churches concentrate on their own schools. Do you want to move it, Tony?
In fact, I will.
I can't go too far because I need to have access to this computer. So in this dual system, the churches concentrate on their own schools in Australian colonies, and of this new reality that faces the various schools, undoubtedly the most successful are the Roman Catholics. And to a large extent, that's because not only the leadership has a commitment to schools, when we're really talking mostly about elementary schools, but also so do the local Roman Catholic people. They're very committed to having their children raised in this way. Whereas in the Anglican and Protestant schools, this variety of schools, and particularly the parochial schools in the parish, the elementary primary schools, they more or less fade into oblivion, and the Anglican and Protestant systems are left with basically just a few, by the end of the 18th century, a few elite secondary schools. So let's have a quick look at Western Australia. I am mindful of a need for a break this time. So, as I said, it was an impoverished colony. Everyone arrived here with a great deal of expectation. They looked at the forests and they thought the soil would be incredibly fertile, and of course they met with nothing but sand, basically. And the whole focus of making the colony wealthy was on farming and pastoralism. And of course the whole ecology of Western Australia was entirely unsuited to anything that farming practices that had been brought with them from Britain, even those few colonists that were actually skilled in farming. There was a thought for a while that they would be able to use some of the massive timber of Western Australia and supply both timber and to some extent horses to the army in India, and that kind of in a halting way went forward. But on the whole, it was not a very happy place to be and was very impoverished, and so there was very little money basically. As I said, in 1840, the government, in emulation of Governor Burke's 1836 New South Wales Act, passes the Churches Act, which is more or less a replication of the same interdenominational funding for churches. In 1847, there were 2 government schools teaching 13 pupils. This wasn't just because there were comparatively few people in Western Australia, but because everyone was basically needed to earn a subsistence living. Children didn't go to school, they had to work. There were Roman Catholic schools, and it's interesting to see the way in which most Roman Catholic settlers at this stage anyway were even more impoverished than the Protestant and Anglican ones, but there was a real commitment to make sure they went to school, to at least get a beginnings, not so much of a, shall we say, an education, but to get a formation in the Catholic faith. Yeah. In the 1840s, there was an education committee passed by the state government, so we're moving to the state government taking more and more control of education. And in 1848, like the rest of the Australian colonies, we bring into Western Australia the dual system with a separate grant for Roman Catholic schools, and this all brought about massive Anglican opposition, because running through Anglicanism up until and including this time is that characteristic of anti-Catholicism. After all, that was the reason why the Church of England in the first place developed. So, what was Anglicanism like on the ground, so to speak, in terms of the devotional life of Anglicans? Well, it looked pretty much like the rest of Christians in this period. So let's look at Sunday. Sunday is the characteristic religious day, if you like, for Christians. What was colonial piety like on Sundays? Well, it was virtually the British Sunday. That British Sunday that had developed by the 19th century, whereby basically everything more or less closes down and you're expected to go to church twice a day, that is morning and evening, and you're not expected to do anything other than religious activities for the rest of the day. So it's very much driven by that kind of Protestant agenda of what we call Sabbatarianism. That is, that basically this is an understanding of the Christian Sunday as a kind of Christian version of the Jewish Sabbath, whereby basically no work shall be done, and no enjoyment either. So basically it's centred around church going, and church going for Anglicans in this period meant more on the whole matins and evensong, that is morning and evening prayer. Recreation was available, but mostly to the religiously indifferent, and the few, very few at this stage, atheists that were around in 19th century Britain. What was happening though, in addition to this, if you like, organised form of religion, there was quite a lot of domestic religion, that is, religion being practised in the home by particularly family prayers. This was a fairly normal part, not just of Anglicans' way of life, but of Protestants and even of Roman Catholics, except there would be different devotions there. They would tended to have used things like the rosary. Anglicans often used parts of or variations to the Book of Common Prayer for family prayers. But there were also little books produced for family prayers, which would be led on the whole by the head of the family, who of course was a man. Yes.
Were there parish churches by this time?
There were, but in some colonies, particularly as you got beyond the line of really quite established settlement, the churches were very far apart, and often clergy, not just Methodists who were actually dedicated to this form, but other forms of churches, clergy, had to use itinerant ministry, sort of travelling around an established pattern and stations or homesteads and other such things. And the other dimension of colonial religion was sectarianism. That is, Protestants, by which we also mean Anglicans at this stage, versus the rest, or Catholics versus the rest, depending on point of view. Let's look though at piety in Western Australia, and we're lucky here to have the journals of an early priest of the church in Western Australia, John Wollaston, who became the archdeacon, became the leading clergyman in Western Australia until the first bishop arrives in 1857. Wollaston arrives around about the early 1840s. He starts off in Australand. He was originally to be the chaplain to the Australand Land Company, who were developing that area. And what he discovered when he arrived here is, the land company was virtually bankrupt. So he had to, he'd sold everything, and he and his family, his wife and his sons, had migrated to this colony, and he discovered that because of the 1840s Church Act, he could not earn a government stipend, which was £100 a year, until a church had been built. So he and his sons had to turn to and build a church, which they did, which is the first church in Western Australia in Picton, down in Bunbury area. It demonstrates the energy and the determination of the man, when he's made archdeacon, what he begins to do is travel through the Western Australian colony, largely Perth and south of Perth, between Perth and Albany. He goes eventually to be the parish priest of Albany. And he keeps a journal of all of these. So we've got actually 3 volumes of his journal, which have just about 20 years ago produced a new volume, new editions, so they're available. And they tell us a lot about the everyday level of life in Western Australia, not just this religious life, but all of the other dimensions he encounters. And one of the things Wollaston encounters on his journey is people practicing the Christian faith. So what he discovers is that this, what I've called domestic religion, is alive in people's homes. They're reading the Bible, not just individually, but reading the Bible to their families, not just in family prayer, sometimes specific occasions. They're engaged in family prayers, many of them once a day or even twice a day. They sing hymns, particularly on Sundays when they gather for family prayers. And they make every attempt to come to a church when they need one of the, if you like, the life rituals. So when they need to be married, which of course they need to, if they want a legal marriage, they have to be married in the church, there's no other option. When they want to be their children baptized, when they want to be buried, and also when women are to go through the ceremony of what's called the churching of women. Has anyone ever heard of this? No, it's quite common in the 19th century. It was common before that, and up until about the early 20th century it begins to fall off. What this was when a woman had given birth, she would go to the church, and it's called the Thanksgiving for the birth of a child later on, but there was a dimension of praying for God to purify them. So there was a bit of, shall we say, very archaic sort of ritual in this. And it was quite popular. It was quite in demand, including by women themselves.
It's a carryover, isn't it, of the Jewish tradition with women?
It may be. It's a very old form of, this idea of ritual and purity is very much a part of Jewish religion, and it may have been something that goes back to the very early days of Christianity. Anyway, it's one of those things that was retained at the Reformation from the Catholic life of the Middle Ages, and was a very big part of Anglicanism and local parish life up to and including the 19th century. So Wollaston would get requests for women to be churched, both by their husbands and also by the women themselves. And yet, Wollaston repeatedly complains, and he wasn't the only clergyman to do so, of religious indifference. So what's going on? We have all of this happening in families, and not uncommonly in colonial settler families, and yet here we have this quite experienced Anglican priest, like many of his other contemporaries, not just Anglican priests, but other forms of clergymen, complaining that the colonists, the settlers, are religiously indifferent. Any ideas?
I mean, where he came from, did he arrive in Western Australia from New South Wales?
No, he arrived directly from Cambridgeshire in England.
So, I mean, there he's basing everything on what was going on there, and people coming to a set building as opposed to having it in their houses,
Yeah,
etc.
good guess, exactly right. For the clergy, the standard of being religious was going to church. Yeah. Now, what's the problem with that standard in a colonial setting like Western Australia?
No churches.
Can't be religious.
No churches, therefore you can't be religious according to the clergy's criteria. There were churches, but they were very far apart, and they cost a lot of money in terms of time and energy and materials. So you only, by the end of the 1840s, there's only about 3 or 4 of them, including the one in Albany until Wollaston gets around to building St John's, a wooden octagonal structure which was built by a local reasonably wealthy layman, in which services were held before there was any priest available. So it's this rather odd thing, and I wrote an article many years ago in the Journal of Religious History about this, because it's really quite strange. And what's happened is historians have bought into this, and therefore they've said, well, look, these Australian colonists were religiously indifferent. Well, hold on, these religiously indifferent settlers, colonists, are doing all sorts of religious things at home. So that doesn't strike me as religious indifference. It's when we realise that the measure that we're often hearing from is from clergy sources, and this measure is about going to church. Now, some of them probably didn't want to go to church, but some of them probably did, but they couldn't go because it was just too far away. Or even if it was reasonably close, the difficulty of transport, many of them wouldn't be wealthy enough to afford a horse or a cart, and also the difficulty of being away from their livelihood, from the farm and this subsistence work, agriculture. They simply couldn't afford that length of time. It would probably have taken some of them the best part of a day there and back to go to church. So we don't get them going to church very much. And we've, of course, really, in terms of large or larger population centres, say by the 1850s, how many have we got in Western Australia, do you think? No.
3 million and Perth.
Yeah, that's about it. Bunbury is kind of developing, but it's a village. Albany's kind of developing, but it's an even smaller village. So basically you've got Fremantle and Perth, which are the only ones that can sort of call themselves towns. So the idea that there's ease of access to a church, even if you wanted to go, and even if there was a priest available, it's just simply nonsense. It can't work.
Would it be fair to say that all Anglican ministers would have had the same view as Wollaston about religious indifference just because you didn't go to church?
I don't know if they all did, because there were only about 10 of them by the 1860s, but it is very common, and it's very common not just among Anglicans. Yeah. I haven't done whether or not every single, because we don't always have sources from each and every one of them.
I suppose I was thinking, is there a theological factions within the church?
There were, as you know, from last week. Yeah.
Would there be some who would think, well, maybe the interior life and what's happening at home is a fair indication of religiosity rather than church attendance?
Right. Two things. For most clergy of whatever persuasion, the exterior and the interior went together. And I think it's highly unlikely also that any clergyman is going to dismiss the idea that going to church is a necessary part of the deal. So I don't think so. The only ones that I would say in the 19th century that would kind of come down on this line in a very, so to say, principled and obvious way would be Quakers. And there are very, very few of such people. There are some. What's her name? The wife of Clifton, the Lieutenant Governor, I think he is, down. She's a Quaker, but they're very, very few. Yeah. So, colonial piety, it seems to me, in this rather domestic way, among Anglicans, because this is who he's visiting really, but I suspect it exists in other Protestant and Roman Catholic families as well, but certainly among Anglicans seems to be alive and well, probably, shall we say, more alive and well than it might even be today. So it's a rather odd conclusion to draw, but as I said, it's drawn because of this clerical criteria of church going.
And were they critical of a financial aspect, that people weren't supporting the church financially?
Not so much, because I think they realised how impoverished, certainly in WA.
So the state was paying a stipend?
The state was paying a stipend until towards the end of the 19th century. It wasn't a lot, but it was more than and more secure than many other people. So it's this £100 a year. Don't get so much of that. There is a bit of it, but it's more this attendance thing. Yeah.
Can I just ask in your history, where does the All Saints Church, which I think was built in 1841 up on the West Swan,
Yes.
how does that connect in with
Wollaston, or with what?
Well, with
No.
Wollaston possibly,
Yeah.
and
No, it doesn't connect with Wollaston. It connects with they were all called chaplains. The colonial chaplain who was in the Swan Valley, a guy called Mears, from memory. There was before him a clergyman there appointed to be missionary to the Aborigines, a guy called Louis Justiniani, and he got more or less run out of town. More of him a little later. And then a more, shall we say, normal priest arrives who's there to be primarily, or turns himself into being primarily chaplain to the colonists, the settlers in Western Australia. And because a number of them, including Moore, the Attorney General, are quite comparatively wealthy settlers, and certainly from more wealthy backgrounds, they've got the wherewithal to build a church. So that's what they do. Yeah. So, as I said, colonial religion, domestic family-based, more or less an informal sort of religion, is widely practiced. Formal church-going religion, less so. Not just because some don't want to do it, but also because it's just simply logistically, for many of them, simply impossible, or with very great difficulty. So you do get them going to church, sometimes quite sacrificially so, but it's more or less things like Christmas and Easter.
And that was the same for Roman Catholics?
Yes, although priests would come round and bring them sacraments and things. So, but there weren't very many Roman Catholics. I think I did a survey of this years ago. By the 1840s, I think it is. So Swan River Colony established 1829. By the 1840s, the Roman Catholics have a religious establishment, including a bishop, a bishop and some nuns and priests. I think from memory, 373 Roman Catholics. So there's not very many of them. Most of them are in Perth and Fremantle. And so beyond that, there'll be very, very few in the, shall we say, in the bush. Yeah. Oops, are we? Oh yes, we are finished. So that's, if you like, the religion, the Christianity of settlers. What about the indigenous people? After all, the 19th century, as we saw last week, is a huge outburst of missionary activity, not just by Anglicans of evangelical or high church or Anglo-Catholic persuasion, but across the board, all religions, all Christian denominations engage in mission. It becomes a sort of sine qua non of being a Christian in the 19th century. It's just this massive explosion, and there are missions to all sorts of indigenous peoples, some of which are very, very successful, particularly in later towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th, towards African peoples, and also locally, so to speak, particularly to Polynesian and the Maori people of New Zealand. So when the churches arrive in Australia, there's an expectation, because they're coming particularly, although the Anglican Church has been there since 1788, they're coming particularly in the 19th century with this massive impetus and enthusiasm for mission, and they arrive with that in mind towards the Aboriginal people of Australia. It is, without exception, across the board, the most widespread, utter failure of any Christian missions in the 19th century. Firstly, why is it a failure? Well, firstly, they are totally unaware of the plurality of Aboriginal cultures, language, and they run up against the nomadic lifestyle. For them, they're all just Aborigines. Well, of course, as we know now, in a sense, there's no such thing. If they had understood it better, they would have understood it was much more like the situation they came from in Europe, where you've got, yes, it's Europe as a landmass, but in that there are Poles and Germans and Swiss and Irish and English and Scots and so forth and so on. It was much more like that. One landmass with a lot of different people, with different cultures, different language, but they kind of had, well, one size fits all. And to be fair, the problem was that many of these peoples were very small in number comparatively to Europe. So they learn one language and discover, well, on the whole, it only communicated with this little group of people. And then because of European diseases and to some extent some warfare, I don't think as broad or as intense as some of our historians, such as Henry Reynolds, wants to argue, but that group of people you might have learned the language for are dying out through no fault of their own. So it became a big problem. And then, of course, much of the missionary strategies were based on stability. As you form a mission station, And from that mission station, you'd go out to people and people would come to you. Well, of course, Aborigine cultures across the board do not have that kind of stability. They're a nomadic lifestyle. And it was very difficult for European missionaries to emulate that nomadic lifestyle, and almost impossible. Not least of which because many of them, particularly the Anglican and Protestant missionaries, were married with families. So there was this real clash between some of the, if you like, cultural and sociological realities of both sets of peoples that that did not contribute at all to the success of any mission. So by the 1840s, there was a fairly common outlook towards Aboriginal peoples in the Australian colonies. These commonality developed these ingredients. Firstly, Christianity was also about civilization. What do we mean by civilization, or what do you think they meant by civilization in mid-19th century?
More like us.
More like us, and us being?
Western Europe.
Yes, that's right. So really it's Europeanization. And the problem was that these two things went hand in hand. You kind of one without the other, like love and marriage, you know. Basically, Aboriginal peoples were judged on two interrelated but essentially really separate criteria: civilization and Christianity. That the Aborigines were a degraded people. They were the most primitive of all people, totally unaware, of course, that had a lifestyle and existence in Australia for longer than any of the European peoples that were coming to evangelize them for tens of thousands of years. And that fundamentally, as a degraded primitive people, they simply could not be civilized. Implied in that was they simply could not be Christianized either.
This is not a far cry. I mean, I think in Africa, from my understanding in the history I read there, I mean, treated the Africans exactly the same.
Yes.
North, south, east, and west.
Yeah. This was not uncommon, but there were two things I want to say. Firstly, that it wasn't uncommon, but it was nevertheless more catastrophically, completely a failure here than anywhere else. And secondly, there were always exceptions. There were always exceptions. But there don't seem to have been quite so many exceptions of people who saw something more than this usual framework within the indigenous peoples they were involved with. The one exception to this kind of very standard settler outlook was that the missionaries insisted, and this is not just Anglican missionaries, this is across the board, missionaries affirmed explicitly and openly that the Aboriginal people were indeed human. I know that seems almost shocking in its obviousness, but for many of the settlers, Aboriginal people were a kind of quasi or subhuman species. So much so that in some cases, such as northern Western Australia and in the Northern Territory in the early 20th century, they were virtually hunted like animals. So Aboriginal people were affirmed to be by the missionaries human people who are both deserving of and need the salvation of Christ. They were not monkeys, they were not subhumans, they were genuine human people. So in that sense, they differed from the settler outlooks. What was very common in the second half of the 19th century was the application of Darwinian principles to human society, called social Darwinism. And just as Darwin posed the idea of the survival of the fittest, which turned out to be rather rejigged into the survival of the strongest. This was the way in which many people, and especially more intellectual peoples, began to see human societies. And therefore, as it was, from their point of view, European society was much stronger, it would eventually lead to the extinction of the Aboriginal peoples. They were a dying race. And all we could really do at best was, as they often put it in a metaphor that's rather unpleasantly said time and again, is to smooth the pillow of a dying race. Yeah.
A bit off topic, was European
Semitism?
Along those lines as well?
No. Oh, well, yes, in one sense it was, because Jews were regarded as a race and as a lesser or ungodly even race. So in that sense it had a racial dimension, but it was much, and it had the same sort of prejudice, but it was more to do with yes, by the 19th century you begin to get a racist dimension to anti-Semitism. Yes, so you're right. And the really ironic, sad, awful thing about all of this is that when in fact Aboriginal people, individuals or sometimes groups, did actually convert to Christianity, because of all of these prejudices and presuppositions and stereotypes, often the missionaries themselves could not recognize that conversion. It didn't fit, right? It didn't fit because, you know, that they couldn't read Greek. They couldn't read. They didn't manifest some of the criteria that were expected of those wishing to be baptized. And so there were, in fact, Aboriginal conversions, but it's as though they never happened. So, because of all that outlook. We're going to leave it there, have a break. So halfway through, more or less, apart from our rather delayed beginning, because we're really beginning to turn to the 20th century now. So take a break for a couple of minutes, do what you need to do, just go outside and stretch your legs just for a minute, because you, in a sense, listening to somebody teach like this, in this rather old-fashioned way, is a big ask of attention. So just grab yourself a couple of minutes or so, and I'll grab myself something to drink.
Cookie jar.
Just seeing all the bishops there. I was wondering, what's the collective noun for a group of bishops?
A murder of bishops. A bench of bishops. That's the usual one.
It's a what?
A bench of bishops.
Bench.
Yes. Because in
Sit on
the House of Lords, they sat on a bench. Yeah.
So actually, that makes me think of a question. So the judiciary in early Australia would have been Anglican influence.
Yes, virtually all colonial officials. Wells the first and quite major exception, but on the whole, I say for the first half of the 19th century, they were all Anglicans, yeah. And still often continue to be after that, but there were others coming through. All right then. Just before we leave missions, just to give you a little bit more heartening news, there was actually quite an exceptional missionary among Anglican missionaries and even in Western Australia, a guy called John Gribble. John Gribble was sent as by the Anglican diocese to be the missionary in Carnarvon. He was sent by Bishop Hale, I think it was. And what he discovered in Carnarvon, he felt was just downright horrible. Missionaries, Aboriginal people came under a piece of legislation called the Master and Servants Act. And if they ran away from the pastoralists, either for cultural reasons or because they actually didn't like the job, they could be and were brought back in chains. And it was virtually a form of slave labour. And Gribble protests about this, and protests about this not just locally, but in print. He writes about it. And quickly finds himself on the persecuting end of the local elite, an elite that has connections to the elite, the Anglican elite in Perth, particularly with John Forrest and the West Australian newspaper. And basically he gets drummed out of town. He eventually goes to be a missionary in New South Wales. And it's a sad thing because actually Gribble was one of the very, very, very few who was equipped to understand Aboriginal people, because as a boy he had grown up in association with them, and so he's well equipped. But in a sense he ran up against some of the rather unpleasant realities of settler economic and cultural and enforced life that was imposed on local Aboriginal people.
But you could say the same thing about Giustiniani, because
Giustiniani, yes.
was also booted out of town because of his
yes, he was.
passion for getting better
yes.
rights for Aboriginals at that time in the York
Yes.
area, I think it was.
No, it's in Swan. About his Giustiniani's temporary or wooden church. The foundations exist under Guildford Chapel, or at the west end of Guildford Chapel. So there have been one or two exceptional Anglicans, but because they were exceptional, they kind of ran up against the more established powers of Anglicanism and quickly stopped being exceptional because they stopped being. Yeah. So it's the good and bad side of this church, let alone anyone's church. All right, so let's look at Anglicanism beyond these original formational periods in Australia. So really from 1836 onwards, Anglicanism in Australia takes the form increasingly of another denomination. It has to develop its own structures, its own accountabilities, its own governance, as a denomination, things which, of course, other Christian churches have long since done, because they've been denominations under the Church of England, so to speak, or under the hegemony, the overall power of the Church of England. And the Church of England didn't need to do many of these things because basically Parliament did it for it. But it couldn't do that anymore, or wouldn't do that anymore. So the first sign of this denominationalism developing in Australian Anglicanism is in 1850 when Bishop Broughton, who's the first and only ever Bishop of Australia, but by then has become Bishop of Sydney because he's divided up his Australian see into various others. There's still no bishop in Western Australia, in Perth. But the bishops of Australia, Adelaide, Melbourne, Tasmania, Newcastle, and the Bishop of New Zealand meet in 1850. And I think Broughton's hope was this would become a kind of independent governance for the church, but one of them, particularly the Bishop Charles Perry of Melbourne, who was an evangelical, was very anxious about losing the state connection. So it didn't kind of go anywhere as such. Synods, though, do begin to develop in the Australian Anglican Church from the 1860s onwards, that is, diocesan synods. And there's a general synod of the Australian Church from 1872. This is much delayed behind its developments in New Zealand when there is a general synod and a very authoritative, powerful central general synod quite early on. And Australia's sort of catching up.
Can I just ask one thing? I think when I read the paper we were asked to read, was it Burke who was very much, he was originally in New Zealand and he felt that the Maoris were quite intelligent people.
Not Burke. Burke wasn't.
Who was it then?
Gray. Gray was.
He thought the Maoris were
yes.
very intelligent,
yeah.
but then when he came here, he felt the Aboriginals
yes.
were quite the opposite.
Yeah.
Do you think that sort of influenced the way that
it contributed? Yeah, because Aboriginals, in terms of their culture, and to some extent you have to say in terms of their appearance to Europeans, just didn't seem to measure up. They didn't have houses, they didn't have villages like Maori did. They weren't kind of warlike people, which 19th century British men particularly respected. So I think that certainly contributed.
Marsden went down the way you're talking.
Yes, that's probably the man's name I was thinking.
Yeah.
It could be loathsome for the Aboriginal Australia because
there's been a lot of, there's a very, very good recent biography of Samuel Marsden, but the big problem is while it's very good, it's very, very big. And it's written by a New Zealand, of all things, political scientist, a professor of political science, who unashamedly, or without pulling any punches, calls much of the New Zealand and to some extent by implication history about Samuel Marsden anti-Christian. It has a real anti-Christian bias. So Marsden was not as brutal as Australians make him out to be, nor was he as disinterested in religion and mission as he's often made out to be. But he did undoubtedly see the Maori as a superior race, yes, yeah. All right, so this ongoing development, but it wasn't until 1962 that a national constitution for the Anglican Church of Australia, still of course in 1962 called the Church of England in Australia, was to develop. So basically what Australian Anglican denominationalism meant, as opposed to New Zealand, is, and still is, a very weak centre and very strong, more or less autonomous diocese. So unlike New Zealand, for example, when General Synod passes a canon, a statute, as they call them in this diocese, which is really an odd term, that is applied by it just being passed to all of the New Zealand dioceses. In Australian denominational structure, General Synod passes a canon, but it doesn't actually have effect until each diocese again passes the canon. They can't change the canon, they can only accept it or reject it, but it doesn't have any effect until a diocese accepts it. So what we have is a very weak centre and a very strong local diocese. And that was the reason why it took so very long, over a century, for a national constitution to get passed. And it took somebody of the clout and, shall I say, political nous of Archbishop Geoffrey Fisher of Canterbury to bring it about during his visit to Australia in the early 60s. So what are the characteristics of Anglicanism in Australia as a denomination? It was the largest Christian church, bar none, until after World War II. In the beginning of the 20th century, 40% of the Australian people self-identified as Anglicans. That's per the 1901 census. It was, during that period, both in the 19th and up until the 1960s, as a form of Christianity, as a church, as a denomination, it was very confident and it was very intellectually engaged. Much of the leading, shall we say, churchmen, church leaders, engaged with various issues from communism to social change to fascism, the rise of, and so forth, came from the Anglican Church. Well, they weren't the only ones, but they were without doubt the largest body and the most engaged and educated body of any denomination. And Anglicans were a very confident group of people, large body of people in the Australian society in this period. It was very imperialist. It regarded the British Empire as a good thing, without question, and to some extent as a God-given thing for the promotion of peace, harmony and civilization. So it didn't have much questioning about the British Empire, and like most Australians, not just Anglicans, it was happy to be known as British, as a part of the British Empire. It was very missionary, notwithstanding the fact that its missions failed, but it was very missionary. Not just missions to Aboriginal peoples, but beyond Australia to Papua New Guinea, and particularly to Melanesia. Yes, so it was a very missionary diocese, denomination. It was also very sectarian. This was common to all the churches. Perhaps not as common as some of the politicians and anti-Christian commentators would have liked to have made it, but it was very sectarian. Whatever else we weren't those people. We weren't Catholics, and this was a purely negative label. And as I said from our last week, it had internal tensions, particularly between evangelicals and Anglo-Catholics, but also to some extent that smaller liberal elite element to be found, particularly among some of the bishops, such as bishops of Melbourne.
Rowan, in Western Australia, has there ever been much of an internal tension theologically in the diocese here?
No, not until more recently. For for two reasons. One, it was small and was kind of off the radar to some extent, most of the 19th century anyway. It didn't have the sort of clout of other Anglican provinces. For example, it takes 3 dioceses to make a province, to make a bishop an archbishop, and I think it was Bishop Riley initially wanted to be Archbishop Riley, so Kalgoorlie got to be made a diocese, so, even though it was basically not able to stand on its own feet. And also to some extent, while there wasn't a large Anglo-Catholic dimension, the first really explicit Anglo-Catholic arrives as Frederick Goldsmith, the Dean of the Cathedral and later first Bishop of Bunbury. Its general churchmanship, to use an old-fashioned term now, tended to be sort of on the high side of middle. Yeah, so there weren't a lot of really strong evangelical forces within the diocese. And that kind of moved gradually, because the Anglo-Catholics were the most dynamic and predominant force in global Anglicanism between the wars, World War I and World War II. It tended to move towards the Anglo-Catholic spectrum. So, for example, when not David Robarts, what's his name? John Hazelwood becomes Dean of the Cathedral around about the 1960s. The Cathedral becomes a very Anglo-Catholic place, and there are folk masses and there's incense and so forth and so on. So on the whole, it's been a kind of reasonably cohesive diocese until recently. By recently, I mean probably the last probably 3 archiepiscopates, yeah. But that's in keeping.
What period is that?
You're going back to probably somewhere during Peter Carnley's episcopate. Not because of Peter Carnley, but to some extent because of changes and dimensions within global Anglicanism. What's happening in the Diocese of Perth, it has been and was and has been and is still a mirror of what's happening more globally. Yeah. All right. Oops. That's all very well, but what I want to do is just move it along. Thank you very much. Okay. So let's look at that sectarian development, because this is a major characteristic, not just of Anglicanism, but of all the Christian churches in Australia, but is particularly prominent in Anglicanism. And when it really intensifies is during World War I. World War I really tests in the influence of the Christian churches in wider Australian society in a major and a quite confrontational way. It does so because the war causes the churches to develop quite quickly during 1914 really, a particular response. I'll go into that response in a moment. But this response developed by the churches is one that they more or less stay with through the whole war. They don't change it as the war develops. And more particularly, it leads to an increasing gap between this perception of the churches, this understanding that the churches have of the war, including, of course, the largest church, the Church of England, and the one that develops in wider Australian society as, of course, the war develops and becomes, in an unprecedented way, a war of death and casualties on an industrial scale, because war is, for the first time, on an industrial scale globally. And so what happens in wider Australian society in response to this unprecedented level of death and casualties and destruction, a move away from war as something that is, in a sense, almost welcomed and glorified, as it was, for example, during the Boer War, into one that becomes a sort of attitude of grim acceptance. And the churches don't, and particularly the Church of England, does not respond quickly or well or positively to this change. And so the war becomes a source of the intensification in Australia of sectarian conflict, both within the churches and because, church people are, throughout society, some of them quite influential. It becomes part of wider Australian society as well, this sectarian division. So what is this response of the churches? Well, the churches have a kind of theology of the war. Well, not a kind of, they do have a theology of the war. And understandably so, after all. What is theology? Theology is simply seeing the world in a God way, seeing the world interpreted as God's world. So it's natural that the churches develop a theological response to war. After all, this is the major reality for years across the world.
Pretty strong in the scriptures of the Old Testament as well.
Well, yes, as we'll see, rather unfortunately so, but anyway. So, firstly, the theological response to the war, which is held by the Protestant and Anglican churches, is that God has allowed the war. Why is the war developed? Well, because they believe God was in control of God's world, what we call providence, that the war has developed because God has allowed it for the purpose of moral regeneration and dealing with sinful nations. And of course, guess who the sinful nation is? Any ideas? Yeah, the enemy, Germany, particularly, yes. But also to some extent Australia, but in a lesser way. Germany, yes, absolutely so. The British Empire, for this purpose of moral regeneration and the judgment upon sinful nations produced by the war, the British Empire is the instrument of God for this. And there is a wide consensus on this issue to begin with across the churches, both Protestant and Catholic. Right? So, in a sense, this is the kind of response that develops early in the war, and this is what the Anglicans and Protestants stay with on the whole. But for the Roman Catholics, there's an increasing disenchantment because, of course, Roman Catholics aren't just in the British Empire, they're in Germany, they're in Austria. These are Catholic powers in many cases. So, it was particularly the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So for Catholics, because of this more global international dimension of their church, there's also developing a sense that, okay, this war, there's more ambiguity attached to it than we perhaps thought, and it's really a kind of unpleasant duty that we have to do. It's not something to be thankful to God or glorified in, it's a kind of unpleasant duty that we just have to grin and bear. This all comes to a head in the conscription campaigns of 1917. It's quickly realised by the Allied forces and by the Axis forces, or the Central Powers, because Axis is a 20th World War II term, that the sheer scale of industrial warfare means that volunteer armies are not sufficient. They have to be conscripted. And so conscription comes in Germany, it comes in Britain, it comes in New Zealand, but in Australia there is a referendum about this. There's actually two referendums. And both times the Australian people say no. But Anglican particularly, and to some extent also Protestant, support for the government's campaign for recruitment is both prominent and public. And in fact, the Church of England, as the Anglicans were known until 1972, I think it is, finally, were the most enthusiastic of all these pro-conscription recruiters and lobbyists and public speakers. So what's the problem in terms of the Anglican Church within Australia in this period, 1917?
Well, there's a more public divergence of view about a matter affecting the entire country.
That's right. And the divergence of view is between?
Catholic and Anglican.
Catholic to some extent and Anglican, but much more importantly,
Between Anglicans and the general population.
yes, that's right, between the Anglicans and general pop. And really what this is getting down to is almost clergy versus the general public. Because there were a number of Anglicans, quite a large number of Anglicans in the general public, who must have voted against conscription in the referendum because, as we know, Anglicans were the largest group in the population. So, what happens is the conscription campaigns of 1916 to 17 intensify radically the sectarian dimension in Australian life. And this is largely, not totally, but largely driven by Anglican clergymen. On the whole, it comes down to, in a simple way, mostly Protestants pro-conscription, Catholics anti, with the exception of the Catholic Archbishop of Queensland or of Brisbane. The Catholic anti-response is fueled by the Dublin uprising in 1916, when basically a small group of radical Republicans take over the General Post Office in Dublin and try to catalyse a widespread rebellion against British rule. And the really inept thing about the British, sadly, is that when, of course, the uprising is defeated because of the massive amount of firepower that the British Army can bring to this, and the Republicans, the survivors, are captured, there is, in Dublin, and generally speaking, an antagonism towards this by the Irish people, because many of these Irish people, particularly the women, have husbands, brothers and fathers fighting in the British Army. What changes is the incredibly oppressive and brutal response of the British towards these rebels, who are on the whole court-martialed and shot without trial within days, including one 16-year-old boy. So what turns into what began as a rather unpopular, totally unrealistic rebel uprising quickly becomes a catalyst for the very thing the rebels hoped it would be. Not because of them, but because of the British. Another inept example. So, of course, the Catholics and because the Catholic Church in Ireland, in Australia, is on the whole an offshoot of the Irish Church. Most of its clergy and many of its adherents are Irish immigrants or Irish descendants. So as I said, there's the two referenda in 1916 and 1917 for conscription. Protestants, particularly the Anglicans, view this as a moral issue. This is not simply a political or a military issue, it's a moral issue. Because, remember, that early theological response says God is on the side of the British Empire in order to bring about moral regeneration and the judgment of sinful nations. Therefore, a conscription to support the British Empire must be a good thing, must be a moral issue. But the Catholics see it only as a political issue, and quite rightly so, I think. As I said, the Anglicans are prominent, unfortunately. So what happens fundamentally is something that's been there all the time, because this goes all the way back to the Reformation of Catholics, and Protestants, and particularly also Anglicans, Church of England, that sectarianism, that opposition to the other, partly what being an Anglican is I'm not a Roman Catholic. And what being a Roman Catholic is, I'm not a Protestant. gets incredibly intensified in Australia. It happens in other places, but Australia more so than virtually any other part of the British Empire. So sectarianism becomes a reality in a very fundamental way for Anglicanism throughout the 20th century, until quite recently. So, there is a revival of Anglicanism, along with other churches in Australia, in the 1950s, with the development of new suburbs throughout all of the Australian states. In 1901, we have states now, not colonies. Why? Any idea?
Migration?
Yes, exactly, migration. People are coming in from not just the traditional sources of immigration, but also non-traditional sources, particularly those that were previously excluded, by which I do not mean the Chinese or Asians, I mean Greeks, Macedonians, Russians, and so forth, Italians. These are always been regarded as semi-white and rather undesirable. But now they come in massive terms, welcomed by the new policies of the immigration policies of the Australian government, but also the traditional sources as well. You know, the £10 POM, the subsidised migration from Britain, means that all of the churches, but particularly the Anglican Church, increases its adherence, increases its number, expands into these new suburbs, and all looks pretty damn good.
The Anglican churches, Rowan, wouldn't have their numbers made up by Greeks, Italians or Slavs.
No, they wouldn't, but they had them made up by massive subsidised British migration, yes. So the others are growing as well, but also so is the Church of England. And this, in a sense, not rebirth, that's going too far, but this revitalisation of Anglican expansion and numbers leads to various attempts by the Church of England to recover its national influence, which has been irreparably harmed, of course, by that sectarian development in World War I. It now has masses of young families, so you've got Sunday schools and youth groups and confirmation, and life looks good, you know. The recovery, you know, to be fair, not just of Anglicanism, but of a Christian influence in Australian society, looks as though it's well on track.
So there would have been a large increase in the number of clergy at this period as well?
Yes, exactly, yes. Never enough clergy at this period, but there's certainly an expansion of clergy as well. Yep. So a place like Wollaston College, not quite the Wollaston College we see today, is built because of this. The development of communities in suburbs, many of which have very little. You know, they're just houses plonked down on the sand, more or less, or the dirt. Churches are very instrumental, including the Church of England, in creating communities. They're the ones who develop youth groups and sports clubs and all sorts of things in these suburban churches. And on the whole, outright atheism in Australia in this period, in the 1950s, is very rare. Religious affiliation does seem to be something that's particularly correlated to urban location. So much of the church expansion and the growth and the confidence comes out of suburban developments, new suburbs. Not so much in what we now think of that term regional and rural Australia.
But the land was set aside for churches in a lot of the Western world.
Yes, it was. But we're not set aside
it was
by governments.
Zoned as.
Yes, but yet the churches had to buy the land. Yeah. But yes, it was zoned, but it didn't just get given to the churches. They had to buy them. But, you know, get a new suburb put up, there would be zones for all sorts of things, most of which never happened or didn't happen. But certainly there would be zones for the churches, but it would be all the churches. But of course, with their numbers and to some extent their investments and endowments, the Anglican Church was in a better position than many to come to the aid of the party and to develop itself. The one thing in comparison to to the Roman Catholic Church it didn't do at all well, and virtually didn't do at all, was parochial schools. So the churches embrace the suburbs because this is where the new migrants are, this is where families are developing, etc., etc. So you get very much a suburban church in this 1950s period. And there's a revival, of course, of confidence as a consequence of all of that. Future's looking good. God is with us. Fantastic. Yes. We're back to where it should be.
Sort of, I don't know the right term, but the social contract, sort of the health systems and social welfare, was that promoted by?
Yes, it was. It was promoted by most of the churches because the churches felt that a government acting in a properly Christian way would be caring of its people, and social welfare was an important dimension of that. But of course this also comes through the whole Labour Party political philosophy that had been part of Labour since its origins.
Everybody was Catholic.
Not entirely, but there was a large dimension of Catholicism, or rather put the other way around, there was a large dimension of Labour Party politics which had the support of Catholics, yes, whereas Anglicans tended to be part of the various conservative parties that preceded the Menzies Liberal Party. Yeah.
Also, this time you get, at the end of the time, you get the Billy Graham crusades and things like that.
Yes,
so
it just all looked really good. Yeah. Until we came to the 1960s and what we might call the development of a secular Australia. As I said before, there was very few atheists, outright atheists in Australian society in the 1950s, and many Australians were connected to one of the churches, and many of them connected to the Church of England. But in the 1960s, in keeping with Western social developments across the globe, we begin to see the rise of a non-religious, non-Christian viewpoint and adherence, what we call secular. The great book on this, the archetypal book on this, is Donald Horne's the book called The Lucky Country, which he published in the 1960s, subtitled Australia in the 60s. What we begin to get is, compared to the 1950s, a diminution in the amount of explicit religious adherence, not just within Anglicans but across the board. Less so within the Roman Catholic Church, but particularly within the Anglican and Protestant churches. Yet at the same time, there's still prominent and common in Australian society at all levels a respect for Christianity. It seemed to be doing good. It seemed to be the upholder of a set of moral values. It seemed to be productive of community. It seemed to be something that either directly or indirectly motivates concern for the underprivileged, the marginalised, the needy. So there is a kind of respect for Christianity. It's as though, well, we all know God exists. Most of us don't want to do anything about it, but it's good that people do. So there's a kind of, it's not even vestigial, it's prominent. It's a common viewpoint that even though we might be diminishing in our church attendance and our religious activities, even in our explicit adherence to a church, nevertheless there's still this common widespread respect for Christianity. So what are the characteristics of a secular Australia as Donald Horne in his archetypal famous book outlines them to be? So we've just got 10 minutes for me to whiz through this. What matters to most Australians, says Donald Horne, is a material standard of living and the ability to buy stuff, which later becomes sort of consumerism, it's known as. And of course, stuff is available in a unbelievably unprecedented way, largely because of the incredible expansion of industrial capacity that one country in the world has undertaken massively, and that country is?
USA?
USA, yeah. The USA undoubtedly was instrumental in defeating the Axis and Japanese powers in World War II because it unbelievably increased its armament and industrial capacity and production in a way that led to its permanent enrichment. Once the war was over, people stopped producing guns and bullets and tanks and ships and produced things like?
Cars.
Sorry?
Cars.
Cars? Yes, although processed food wasn't so much of a big thing at this stage, it did become later on. What else? What did you put food in?
Fridge.
Yeah, a fridge and a washing machine and a vacuum cleaner. All of these things that were seen to be family appliances that became not just a luxury but a necessity. Consumerism took off because it seemed like a really good thing. And in many cases, for many women who were doing the only housework, along with all the other damn things they had to do, it probably was. The commitment to equality. And the really radical thing about this in the 1960s was seen in a particular referendum. And what was that referendum about doing?
Aboriginals.
Yes. And what was it saying Aboriginals could be? Citizens. I remember when I first arrived in Australia, I just couldn't believe this. You mean until 1967 they weren't citizens? So the 1960s was about equality, not just about equality between other white races, not just equality about immigration and the destruction, of course, finally, of the White Australia policy, but particularly addressing that long-standing, ghastly, oppressive inequality of the Indigenous and later peoples, making the Australians, Aboriginal people, Australians. It was incredibly self-contented. We were, as Donald Horne says, the lucky country. This was God's own country. This was the best place in the world to be. Australia was a thoroughly good thing.
When did Australia stop thinking of itself as part of the British Empire? Straight after the Second World War?
No, not by any means. That began it because US became, what was it that John Curtin called it? The powerful friend, the great and powerful friend. And of course, the fall of Singapore was a massive destruction to the confidence of Australia in Britain. And that alliance with the United States rather than Britain was the direction of Australia. But most people culturally still thought of themselves as British. They still talked about going home, when they meant a trip to Britain.
Did Menzies keep it going?
Yes, I think in some ways he did. Yes. And there were some good things about it. That was how most people felt. That was how many of the institutions that have led, I think, to a stable country in Australia came from Britain. So there were some good things about it. But I think particularly in the 1960s, largely for a number of reasons, from the Asian immigration and also mass travel. People began to experience cultures beyond the British, young people particularly, but others as well. So it began to change, yes. Australians embraced what was then called the permissive society, and this largely had to do with sexuality. But the idea that tradition, the past did not necessarily, in fact, did not, in some cases, provide you with guidance for the present or the future. That it was too restrictive, and that basically it would be good for society if we were much more, if we permitted a lot of other things, and this particularly had to do with sex. But it led to a kind of questioning of other givens as well. And Christianity, while it was respected, tended to degenerate in many Australians' viewpoint into what was called wowserism. that basically Christianity was about doing good in such a way that it meant not doing a good time. Yeah. So Christianity began to take on a kind of restricted negative dimension or label or attitude. And all of this began to do something that had never really happened in Australia before, the marginalisation of the churches. The churches had always been, throughout this entire period in Australia, central in Australian society. Not always massively adhered to, but always with a sense of respect, and always with most people in some way adhering to or practicing in a major or lesser way the Christian faith. Now, from the 1960s, not just the churches, but Christianity itself began a long, slow march, which it's still on, towards the margins of Australian society, the margins of Australian values, the margins of Australian consciousness. So we have this is the last slide, marginalised churches from the 1960s. Marginalised because of sectarianism, something the churches to some extent brought upon themselves. Marginalised because of World War I and the whole conscription debate and the kind of rather inept theological reasoning of the churches. Marginalised because of the Depression. On the whole, the church's response to the Depression was not very good. It simply was not really prepared to deal with need on that large, structured, widespread basis. Its charitable responses have been really based on small numbers or individuals. Now, of course, many people, for no fault of their own, were in need. And the churches, on the whole, particularly the Anglican Church, did not gear itself up readily or well to dealing with structural need. And finally, secularisation.
But that wasn't just happening in Australia.
No, these things are not unique to Australia. These things are part of the way in which Western society itself is developing, and of course, particularly in terms of the cultural freedom, diversity, to put it on a positive note, the development of the permissive society. This was something which began in other places, particularly began on the east, the western seaboard of the United States. Mass travel connected people with this. They discovered it. And phenomenon that were at best not national became international. And the great example of that, of course, is the Woodstock Pop Festival, which became a phenomenon globally among the youth of most Western societies. All right.
When does the Sydney evangelistic approach start to have an impact?
Well, it's always had an impact. We'll talk more about this next week, but yes. No, it's fine.
But
it's always been a powerful force in Australian Anglicanism because of its wealth. And then it did keep together cohesively as a form of evangelical Anglicanism, but it was still very Anglican, largely because of A, its wealth, B, the size of Sydney, and C, because it structured its cohesiveness around its theological college. But more of that, and the development of what I would say is a kind of a non-Anglican Sydneyism, so to speak, next week, when we look at the transformation from what I've called a secular Australia to a secularist Australia, and positive ideology of secularism, and the challenges that will bring, and does bring, to Australian Anglicanism, and not just Australian Anglicanism, but Anglicanism per se. Here endeth the third lesson.
I'm just sorry, go back to song. Sorry, one quick question. If Christianity at this point is starting to decline,
Yes.
how does other religions such as Hinduism, the Muslim,
They grow, very, very small growth, but they grow largely through immigration, not through conversion or non-ethnic adherence.
okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Sorry about the minor catastrophe at the beginning, but we got there in the end through, thanks for your patience. Yes. I will, hopefully the lecture this time has been recorded, and I will put the PowerPoint up on the Moodle probably on Monday. I've got a fairly full day tomorrow.
One thing I'd like to ask is with regards to the next assignment,
Yes,
is that due next?
yes. For internal students, it's due
This
next.
Friday.
Yes,
First
that's
one
right.
is Friday.
Yeah. The first one's due tomorrow, and the second one for internal students is due Friday week, and for external students it's a week later because of their access to the lecture.
So it's not.
I will get it back to you, hopefully, the first one, by the end of next week.
Which is the last end of the course.
Yeah.
Yes, but I'll get it back to you, the second one, obviously by email.